Our keynote speaker is one of America's most important and gifted journalists. He is widely published, particularly when he writes about one of the most important political trends in America today, the suppression of science. All across the country, at every level of government and in virtually every arena of public policy, Chris Mooney has found evidence of a coordinated assault on objective truth by those who place ideology above all other considerations. Chris Mooney's book, The Republican War on Science, was hailed by Scientific American as a, quote, well-researched, closely argued, and amply referenced indictment of the right wing's assault on science and scientists. His book is a landmark piece of political reporting, and the alarm it sounds is particularly meaningful to those of us who support a woman's right to choose. Our issue, reproductive health and freedom, is the epicenter of the conservative movement's fight to suppress rational scientific discussion and replace it with conservative religious ideology. From comprehensive sex education in schools to emergency contraception over the counter to the very definition of life, conservative politicians are legislating theology into every aspect of our work. Chris Mooney has researched, documented, and alerted us to the serious consequences of this disturbing trend. I've had the opportunity to spend all afternoon with Chris, and I can tell you you're going to enjoy what you're about to hear. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chris Mooney.
Well, I'm a journalist by training, so I'd like to begin this talk the way I would begin any good journalistic feature story, which is by painting a scene for all of you. So let me take you back to the morning of December 29th, 2004. President George W. Bush has found himself in something of a difficult and uncomfortable situation. He is taking questions from reporters at a press conference. These are never his best moments. And on this particular morning, he's been utterly stumped. This is Bush's first public appearance following the tsunami catastrophe that devastated India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and many other nations. And the question from a journalist that stumped our president was this: did the United States have a warning system in place for the purpose of detecting tsunamis? And this was Bush's response.
Civil defense air raid siren system.
Yeah, I just have to look into it. That's a very legitimate question. I presume that we are in pretty good shape. I think our location in the world is such that we may be less vulnerable than other parts, but I am not a geologist, as you know, and but I think it's a very legitimate question. I've so far.
Yes. Well, there's much to unpack here. But I'd just like to focus on the most quotable part of this little excerpt I played for you when the president said, "I'm not a geologist, as you know." Now, I suspect Bush's wisdom here was merely accidental. But the point is an important one. Because with those words, "I'm not a geologist, as you know," the president pretty perfectly stated just how important reliable scientific information is in a modern, technologically advanced democracy like our own. Today in America, we don't expect of our political leaders that they master all of the intricacies of different scientific issues. Now, there are exceptions like the physicist Rush Holt, who represents Princeton, New Jersey in Congress. His constituents drive around with bumper stickers reading, "My congressman is a rocket scientist." And Rush Holt is a pretty smart guy. He also won Jeopardy 5 times. But the point is that he's not exactly the norm in Congress. We don't expect every elected representative to be Rush Holt, but we do expect of all of them that they at least establish strong channels of communication between themselves and scientists so that political decision-making can be well-informed. And that's what's troubling about Bush's statement about not being a geologist. We don't expect Bush to be a geologist. We merely expect him to talk to them. And why do we expect this? As citizens, we have every right because so many political issues today depend upon good scientific information. I'll just give you a couple samples. How to prevent a bioterror attack, whether we should allow therapeutic cloning, what kind of hurricane protection we need in order to defend a city like New Orleans on a 1,000 or 5,000 year timescale. whether Iraq's confiscated aluminum tubes were intended for centrifuges and therefore a secret nuclear weapons program, or whether they were merely intended for more conventional rocketry. A lot was riding on that particular scientific issue. And all of these issues, and I could give you a completely different list, we need good scientific information to filter into policy, and if it doesn't, then there's a serious risk that bad, wrong-headed, even dangerous decisions will result. And that's why I believe that we are now facing a crisis over the relationship between politics and science in the United States. Scientific information is under attack government-wide. At agency after agency, we've seen scientific reports edited, scientists themselves muzzled, unable to speak to the press, and then just basic distortion, misrepresentation, and outright suppression in some cases of scientific information. This is a crisis over politics and science, and I would submit to you that the crisis requires a political explanation in order to understand why it actually exists. I think I have that explanation. I believe that what we're seeing is what we would expect to see in light of Republican political rule in the United States in the 21st century. Now, let me qualify that. I know there are some Republicans in the audience. It's not every single last Republican who is guilty of distorting science, and I know that a lot of you are certainly not guilty. You know, Governor Schwarzenegger is not a global warming denier. Sherwood Boehlert, House Science Committee Chair, has got great credentials on science. But they are not in the mainstream of their party today, and it's the party mainstream, its infrastructure, and its leadership that I'm criticizing. Because again and again, we have seen conservative Republicans or political appointees ignore or distort widely accepted scientific information. And again, the decision to engage in this ignoring or distorting of science has the convenient outcome of appeasing the goals of certain special interest groups or large corporations that are part of the Republican base. This is a political strategy, and it's playing out in multiple areas of public policy. First, there are the issues that industry or big business cares about, like global warming, mercury pollution, endangered species protections, the health risks of tobacco or certain foods. On these issues, repeatedly, we've seen Republican politicians ignore or distort science in such a way that the distortion tends to affect and appease the interests of large corporate donors. Then there's another constellation of issues, like evolution, embryonic stem cell research, whether there are any serious health risks from abortion to the woman who has the abortion, sex ed, condom effectiveness, Plan B emergency contraception, the so-called morning after pill. These are the issues that get the religious right all fired up. And repeatedly, we have seen Republican politicians or political appointees ignore or distort science. And again, the distortions have the convenient outcome of appeasing this part of the political base. Now, let's be fair. Misuses of science have occurred on the left. It happens. I'm not denying it. To just give a brief example, animal rights activists and environmentalists have been repeatedly charged with taking positions that don't have enough scientific support. I think that this has been blown out of proportion, but I think that there are some cases in which it is valid. But I ask only that we keep a sense of perspective here. First, Republicans are running the whole government. Second, they're ignoring and distorting science in such a widespread way, and this is affecting so many important issues right now that I don't believe there's any serious comparison between the two sides. It's not that the left is innocent, it's just that today, and this may change, but today, the political right is much more guilty. And you know, how we reached this point is an interesting story. If you awoke one day with an idea, an unusual insight that you believe to be divinely inspired, you would have a hard time convincing universities and scientific journals that your new theory automatically ought to count as established science. Or if you managed a large corporation and you wanted to change the public's perceptions about the health risks of a product that you're producing, maybe you already have it on store shelves. Again, you'd have a hard time winning support for your new theory at respected educational institutions. But what's so ingenious is that today's political right has found a way around all of that. They have created an entire infrastructure that is then used to support political abuse and misuse of science. And this infrastructure allows for an end run around universities, scientific journals, and all of the more traditional scientific gatekeepers. Instead, the conservatives today turn to think tanks, advocacy groups, and often a small group of scientific outliers who can be relied upon to provide scientific sounding arguments that help conservatives get to the political goal that they want to reach. These think tank-based arguments may not prevail within the scientific community, but you have to understand that's not really the goal here. The goal is to influence the media, and through the media to influence the public and policymakers. And in so-called media debates, winning does not require having a preponderance of the evidence on your side, unlike in the scientific community. Instead, for those who are setting out strategically to attack a particular piece of scientific information that they don't like for some reason, winning really means creating the perception of debate, or that there are two legitimate sides of the issue. That's all they have to do. And in this effort, the conservative ideas industry, the think tanks, as well as some journalists and publishers are all pretty much working on the same page. And I'd like to give you an example of how the process works. Not too long ago, the Heritage Foundation, which is a very prominent think tank on the political right, held an event to promote a book by a guy named Tom Bethel called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Science. Now, Bethel is the anti-Mooney, or perhaps I am the anti-Bethel, but his book is published by Regnery Press, it's a very conservative press. They put out a lot of anti-Clinton titles in the 1990s. And let me tell you a little bit about this book that Heritage was promoting. If you were to go to your local bookstore and you were to pick up Bethel's Politically Incorrect Guide to Science, which I don't recommend that you do, but if you did so and you read the top cover line of the book, you would read this. It says, "Liberals have hijacked science for long enough. It's time to set the record straight." Not a sentiment that I endorse, but you can see how people who buy Regnery Press books would get a little fired up by this. But interestingly, if you had gone to Amazon.com before the book was actually out and looked at the cover image there and downloaded it to your desktop, as I did, in order to preserve the evidence, you would have read a different cover line. It said, "Liberals have hijacked science for long enough. Now it's our turn." And you really have to wonder what was going through the head of the person who wrote that. But this is a book that does hijack science. It denies evolution. It denies human role in climate change. And it's really just getting started, because in a chapter entitled "A Political Epidemic," it questions the seriousness of AIDS in Africa. And in fact, the author, Bethel, has previously promoted the ideas of those who deny that HIV causes AIDS. And we're still getting warmed up here. He has also in the past, although not in this book, but in the past cited the views of, quote, dissident physicists in order to question Einstein's theory of relativity. Although, to be fair, he appears to have made a concession on this point, and he may now accept that Einstein was onto something. So I watched this Heritage Foundation event online, and it was also on C-SPAN. Here we have a book that's full of very dubious misrepresentation of science, yet its author is lauded, celebrated, and then not asked any hard questions by the audience. This is happening at one of the right's leading think tanks. And that is what we're dealing with. I want to explain to you how this think tank-based strategy plays out in one key area known very well to this audience. And here I'm talking about attacks on scientific information with serious relevance to sexual health. And I want to do so by introducing you to a cast of characters who I fondly, but perhaps not too fondly, call the Three Daves and a Joel. Now, who are these guys? On the Christian right, as you know well, they have a very particular view of sexual propriety, and they are often misusing science to support their pro-abstinence, anti-contraception, and anti-choice agenda. But where does their science come from, their quote-unquote science that they're constantly citing and using? The answer is it comes from guys like this. Scientists, they have PhDs, who are also Christian conservatives and who are regularly generating arguments that help advance the Christian right's agenda on sexual health. Let me go into a little bit more detail here. Let's introduce you to Dave number one. This is David Reardon. He is with a group called the Elliott Institute, again, the think tank thing. He is well known for arguing that abortion causes mental illness to women later in life. Now, this is a notion that is far from the mainstream of science. It is, in fact, rejected by the American Psychological Association, but he is not giving up. Interestingly, if you look at what he's written about this topic, you find something very revealing, I think, and let me just show you a quote. He wrote at one point that because abortion is evil, we can expect and can even know that it will harm those who participate in it. Nothing good comes from evil. Now, if you're laughing, it's because you're realizing, like I do, that this is not scientific thinking. It's, I would say, perhaps a little bit more theological. Let me introduce you to the next Dave, Dave number two, David Prentice. He's with the Family Research Council, a prominent religious right group. And he is involved in the abortion wars through the embryonic stem cell issue because, of course, they're closely linked, and he is famous for arguing that adult stem cell research using regenerative body cells found in the bone marrow, the liver, brain, other parts of the body, is a rival to or perhaps even superior to embryonic stem cell research. Again, this is a view rejected by the National Institutes of Health, the International Society for Stem Cell Research, and most of the researchers doing work in the field. Nevertheless, I talked to Prentice. He says that he is a Christian conservative, but he says that's not how I argue these debates. I'm arguing from the science. Well, if he's arguing from the science, why aren't his views closer to those of the National Institutes of Health? I don't know. Dave number 3, most likely to know this guy, David Hager, former member of the FDA's Reproductive Health Drugs Advisory Committee, and I believe that Planned Parenthood rightly opposed his being appointed to this committee. Hager is the apparent originator of the argument that swayed the FDA on Plan B. The argument was a scientific one. It was that there's not enough information, not enough data about how younger adolescent girls will use this drug. Hager made this argument at the advisory committee meeting. It did not sway his fellow committee members at all. They voted 23-4 that this drug, this safe and effective drug, should be available over the counter. But the agency picked up this argument, and that's what they used. And once again, when Hager discusses to his base what he was doing on this topic, it's quite revealing. Let me give you this quote. He says, I argued the point from a scientific perspective, and God took that information, and he used it through this minority report that he filed to influence the decision. You don't have to wave your Bible to have an effect as a Christian in the public arena. We serve the greatest scientist. We serve the author of all truth. All we're required to do is proclaim that truth. This is a speech at a college in Kentucky. One last character, there's only one Joel. Joel Bryn, Breast Cancer Prevention Institute, another think tank. He's famous for arguing that abortion increases the risk of breast cancer. Again, not a mainstream scientific position. In fact, it was rejected by the National Cancer Institute. He's also written something interesting about this in Physician magazine, which is a publication of Focus on the Family, a prominent religious right group. He pointed out that getting interested in this abortion breast cancer link that he believes in was closely tied to his religious conversion. With a new belief in a meaningful universe, I felt compelled to use science for its noblest, life-saving purpose. So why have I showed you all these guys? What do they have in common? Besides the fact, as many of you in the audience will have noticed, they're all men. Perhaps slightly higher incidence of mustaches than the general population. But that's not what I'm driving at. No, what we've got here is a picture gallery of prominent scientists on the Christian right who provide politically convenient, scientific-sounding arguments that help Christian conservatives advance their political agenda and that get picked up by politicians. Now, these are outlier viewpoints at best, but they have had considerable political influence. And so what we're seeing is that the Christian right is actually minting its own scientific experts. Why should this worry us? Well, politicians don't just wake up in the morning and say, you know, I think I'll twist some science today. What happens is they want to reach a particular goal, and they need information, data, in order to get there. Well, now it's being provided to them, and they can cherry pick it at their leisure. And that's what they're doing. And that's why we're having such a problem, one of the main reasons why we're having such a problem with politics and science right now. Now, I'll just end by saying that I think that this is really unfortunate because it is going back on a noble tradition that I associate with C. Everett Koop of how a devout religious believer should act when it comes to science and the public sphere. Koop was, we know, he was anti-choice. He was conservative and Christian. But as Attorney General, he did not let this get in the way of his presentation of the science. He was actually asked to address by Ronald Reagan in a report the same issue that David Reardon works upon, the link between abortion and women's health, or the alleged link. And he refused to do this report. And when he refused, because he thought it was for political motives that he was being asked to do it, he said this: if I'd put out the kind of report that was not scientific, that did not recognize the lack of physical evidence of what they wanted to know, it would have been attacked and destroyed by scientists and statisticians. So it's unfortunate that the Koop tradition has fallen away. And also, well, the picture's gone, but you may have noticed that Koop had facial hair but no mustache. Of course, we wouldn't really care, right, if none of this stuff was actually having any impact. But what's most alarming is that these arguments, this misinformation, is flooding our government. Taxpayer-funded agencies whose job is to use science to serve and protect us in this administration no longer seem capable of doing the job. Let's just look at some of the case studies from the Bush administration. We can no longer trust the Department of Health and Human Services to put out accurate information about the effectiveness of condoms for preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. We can no longer trust the FDA, that is clear, to make decisions about controversial drugs like Plan B emergency contraception on the basis of science and science alone, rather than allowing a moralistic agenda to skew the agency's behavior. Those are the issues religious conservatives care about. Now let's switch over to the environment. We can no longer trust the Fish and Wildlife Service to use the best available science standard to enforce the Endangered Species Act. We can no longer trust the Environmental Protection Agency or the government's climate change science program to put out accurate reports on global warming that have not had their contents edited by political actors. There's a whole alphabet soup of these government agencies. Collectively, they have a terrible track record, not only in presenting scientific information, but in dealing with their own scientists, who are often prevented from speaking to the public and to the media about what they actually know. So you just have to ask yourself, will a young, talented scientist really want to go serve in one of these federal agencies? Will the decisions they're making be well informed? Is science still serving as the foundation for measures to protect us? I, frankly, find it hard to trust in this conclusion anymore. So now the question becomes, what can we do? How can we restore scientific integrity to our government, to public life? It's a question I get asked repeatedly as I've spoken on politics and science across the country. At the end of the speech, scientists and scientist defenders say, what can I do about this problem? And it wasn't long before I realized that my instinctual answer to this question, by my book, was probably not enough, maybe necessary but not sufficient. So I started looking for a better answer, and I realized quickly it's a pretty daunting task, but there are some obvious steps we can take. First, there have been bills proposed, so-called scientific integrity legislation. The details vary, but the basics are not so objectionable. There are things like bans on forced editing of scientific reports in the government, making sure that scientists have free speech and freedom of association, making sure that scientists have whistleblower protections, making sure that scientific advisory committees cannot be tilted or staffed with people not qualified to be on the committees. It's really sad that we would have to actually legislate these sorts of things. They really ought to be obvious, but the record of the Bush administration suggests that they are not obvious at all, and so perhaps they need to be codified. That's one suggestion. And of course, even as we must protect the integrity of government science, we must at the same time strengthen scientific advice to our government. You may or may not know that in 1995, the Gingrich Republicans swept into power and pretty promptly did away with their world-renowned scientific advisory office, the Office of Technology Assessment, in what I think can only be called a stunning act of self-lobotomy. We should restore the Office of Technology Assessment or something like it. And getting rid of it, of course, really opens the door for all of this politically shaped science that I've told you about to get into the policymaking process and influence members of Congress. They're getting agenda-driven information rather than information from their own scientific advisory office. When it comes to advice for the president, problems also exist. John Marburger, the president's science advisor, is certainly competent to do his job, but we recently learned that President Bush met with novelist Michael Crichton. This is revealed in a new book by the journalist Fred Barnes. Bush met with Crichton, apparently to discuss global warming, and according to Barnes, this conversation reaffirmed Bush's, quote, dissenter view on the subject. I find this pretty outrageous. You may remember that in 2001, the president asked the National Academy of Sciences what the state of understanding was on global warming, and the National Academy of Sciences report could be summarized in one word: duh. It's happening. Humans are causing it. Sea levels are rising. Global average temperatures are rising. You know, blah, blah. It was in the first two sentences. On science, maybe it's just me, I think Bush should listen to the national academies, I confess, rather than to novelists who write didactic fiction. Reforming scientific advice, though, may still not be enough. We also have to do something about the media. I think that certain norms of journalism actually allow reporters to be exploited by those who are strategically trying to abuse and distort scientific information. Here I'm talking specifically about the norm of 50-50 balance between both sides. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes there's a real debate on a scientific topic and you really want to know where the scientific community is. Some people over here, some people over here. Sometimes special interests are strategically trying to undermine a particular piece of scientific information that's well established, and they want to create a controversy. And so if you cover it that way, you're playing right into their hands. So some tips for reporters: there's no scientific controversy over evolution, so don't structure your story that way. There's no scientific controversy over the basic question of whether humans are causing climate change, so don't structure your story that way. There is no scientific controversy over the alleged abortion breast cancer link, so don't structure your story that way. I'm not saying that journalists should censor the dissenters, not ever quote the three Daves and a Joel, as I showed you, but at the very least, journalists should contextualize these viewpoints and explain to the public that they are outlier positions in the scientific community. As I would put it, journalists should stop the he said, she said, we're clueless coverage, and instead see it as their duty to help the public understand what's known and what isn't. Now, there's still more that must be done in the way of reform. Scientists are not without blame here. They're not the ones creating the misinformation, but they're terrible communicators. And they don't explain what they know to the public very well, and neither do they explain why science matters to policy, to democracy, to security, to good decisions for our citizens. Scientists are not out there making this case. Scientists and their defenders, all of you, need to become better advocates. And I'm not saying become advocates for Democrats. I'm saying become advocates for the integrity of science. And scientists in particular need to learn to speak to the public in a language that it understands, and to value those scientists in their ranks who are good communicators. And they need to realize that if the public doesn't understand something about science, you don't just blame the public. Maybe you should blame yourself for not doing a better job of trying to explain. There's another failure, another problem on the part of scientists. Some of them, when defending evolution, unfortunately conflate that with attacking religion. This is something I say gets me in trouble, even with some of my most sympathetic audiences. Now, I defend a right to religious unbelief, but we have to recognize that the evolution battle is part of the culture war. It's not really about science, except insofar as the anti-evolutionists repeatedly misuse science and claim to be engaging in scientific activities when they're not. But really, what's going on here is conservative Christians believe that evolution is destroying religious belief, and that this in turn is leading to moral chaos. I think they're wrong on both points, but I can't imagine why anyone would want to reinforce a damaging and divisive stereotype. But when scientists attack religion while defending evolution, that's pretty much what's happening. So I would strongly advise against that. At the end of the day, though, it may be that none of this is enough. Maybe we have to get more directly political. Again, I'm not saying that scientists and their defenders should automatically vote Democrat. As I've said, there are some Republicans with good credentials on science. But what I am saying is that all of us, all of you, we have a right to evaluate our politicians on the grounds of truthfulness and integrity. And if a politician has a record of distorting scientific information, that is grounds for voting against that politician. Our guiding principle should be this: it's no more legitimate to mislead the public about science, especially policy-relevant science, than it is to mislead the public about the causes for war or the percent of a tax cut that goes to the middle class. Finally, what we all have to recognize is that misleading the public about science is an inherently political activity. And once we recognize this, we have every right to respond in kind. Thank you.